It was a little past midnight, and Madison could feel the emptiness settling in as she drove down the endless road flanked by tall, looming pines. Her GPS was no longer giving her updates, and her phone had long ago lost signal. She hadn't seen another car or even a house in miles. She was alone in a dark sea of trees, guided only by her headlights and the dim outline of the winding road ahead. A glance at her fuel gauge confirmed her worst fear. She was nearly out of gas. The needle hovered dangerously close to E, and she hadn't passed a gas station since leaving the interstate. She tried to reassure herself. She'd seen signs for a town up ahead and figured she could make it there if she drove slowly. But the road seemed to stretch on forever, her surroundings growing denser and darker with every mile. She started feeling a creeping sense of dread as the trees closed in around her like watchful sentries. The car began to sputter. With a reluctant sigh, she accepted that her journey was over for now. She pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath her tires. When she turned off the engine, an oppressive silence settled over her, amplified by the forest that seemed to breathe around her. The full darkness outside the car made her feel even more isolated. She clutched her phone, hoping that by some miracle, a signal would appear. But the screen stayed blank, the no service message taunting her. Just as she was contemplating her options, she saw lights, two faint beams in her rearview mirror, slowly approaching. Relief flooded her. Someone else was out here, and maybe they could help. She waved frantically as the vehicle, an old truck, slowed to a stop behind her. Its headlights were blinding, casting long shadows across the trees. The truck's door creaked open, and a man stepped out, moving slowly and deliberately. He looked ordinary enough, but something about his calm demeanor sent a chill down her spine. He wore a thick jacket and a weathered baseball cap, and his face was mostly obscured in shadow. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice gravely and low. "Yeah, I ran out of gas," she replied, forcing a smile. I was hoping you might have some, or maybe you know where the nearest station is?" The man tilted his head, studying her. His silence lingered just a little too long, making her uneasy. "Not many people come through here at night," he finally said, his tone flat. Madison forced another smile, trying to lighten the tension. "Well, I'm not from around here, obviously. I must have taken a wrong turn or something." The man took a few steps closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. She noticed then that his truck was old and battered, with its hood dented and one headlight cracked. Her instinct told her to roll up her window, but she didn't want to appear rude or ungrateful. "You know," he began, leaning down so that his face was level with her open window, "people don't usually stop on this road." Something about his stare unnerved her. It was cold, too intense, like he was studying her reactions more than listening to her words. "I didn't exactly have a choice," she stammered. "Can you help me or not?" He paused, his mouth curling into a slow smile. "I might have a gas can in the back." She felt a wave of relief. "That would be amazing. Thank you." Without another word, he walked back to his truck. She watched as he rummaged around, her eyes straining in the dim light. Her relief was quickly replaced by unease when she noticed he was taking a long time. It looked like he was moving things around, pulling out ropes, chains, and some kind of large tarp. Her heart began to race. What is he doing? Before she could second-guess herself, she locked her doors and kept one hand on the ignition, ready to try starting the engine again if she had to. She watched him in her mirror as he finally pulled out a gas can and approached her car. Her hands shook as she lowered the window just an inch. "Here," he said, lifting the gas can up to show her. "Got enough here to get you to the next town, but it'll cost you." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. His smile was no longer friendly. It felt predatory. "Oh, I don't have much cash on me," she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Maybe I can just call someone and pay you back?" The man's smile faded, replaced by a dark glint in his eyes. "No signal out here, sweetheart. Ain't nobody coming." The words settled around her like a death sentence. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to do anything but sit there waiting for him to make the next move. She forced herself to act calm, smiling weakly. "Look, I appreciate it, but I think I'll just wait until morning. Thanks anyway." She rolled up her window completely and averted her gaze, hoping he'd take the hint. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned close, pressing his hands against her window, his smile gone. "That's not very friendly," he muttered, voice barely a whisper. Madison's pulse thundered in her ears. She forced herself to keep her gaze steady, refusing to let him see her fear. She had to stay calm, had to act like she wasn't terrified out of her mind. The man stared at her for another long moment, his fingers tapping slowly against the glass, each tap resonating like a clock ticking down. "Suit yourself," he finally said, voice low and mocking. He took a step back, then walked slowly toward his truck, but he didn't get in. Instead, he just stood there, watching her with that same cold, calculating gaze. Minutes passed. Madison's hands gripped the wheel, her breathing shallow as she kept her eyes locked on his form in the rearview mirror. She didn't dare move or start her car, terrified of what he might do if she tried. And then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled again, a sick, twisted smile, before he turned and got back into his truck. The headlights blinded her as he backed up, the beams illuminating her terrified face like a spotlight. She watched as his truck slowly disappeared down the road, leaving her in darkness once again. For a long time, she couldn't move, her body paralyzed with fear. She sat there in the dark, surrounded by the quiet forest, too afraid to even attempt to start her car. She wasn't sure how long she waited, but eventually the faint glimmer of dawn began to break over the trees. Madison finally started her car, praying it would have enough gas to get her to safety. As she drove away, she glanced back one last time, and her stomach dropped. In the road where she had been parked, she could make out the faint outline of a man's footprints leading to where her car had been, and another set leading back into the woods. The man had been waiting, watching her all along. The storm had picked up fast. Chloe and her brother Ben were driving home after visiting friends, winding through the back roads that cut through miles of isolated farmland. They knew they were far from any towns, and with lightning crackling across the sky, every flash revealed the empty fields and dense woods around them. Chloe kept glancing out the window, feeling the weight of the vast emptiness pressing down. The gas gauge was sinking fast, and Chloe's heart raced. They were low, critically low. "Ben, we need gas," she said, her voice edged with panic. "Like now." Ben gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "I know, I'm watching it." As if on cue, the car started to sputter. Ben cursed, and they both watched helplessly as the engine choked and died, leaving them stranded in the middle of the dark road, trapped in the storm with only the thin beam of the dome light between them and complete darkness. Chloe's phone was dead, and Ben's had barely 1% battery left. He attempted to call for help, but the screen flickered and died before he could connect. They sat in silence, the only sound the steady patter of rain on the roof. "Maybe someone will come along soon," Chloe said. But they both knew the roads were deserted at this hour. Then, just as they were beginning to lose hope, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the thick darkness. Chloe's relief was almost instant, but Ben's eyes narrowed as he watched the car approach. It was moving too slow, crawling down the road as if watching them. As the vehicle approached, they saw it was a large, rusted van, its paint peeling and windows tinted dark. It came to a stop right next to their car, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The van just sat there, the driver invisible behind the dark glass. Ben leaned over, whispering, "I don't like this, Chloe." But then, the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, moving slowly toward them. He was tall, dressed in an old tattered coat that hung off his frame like a second skin. His face was obscured in shadow, but Chloe could make out a wide grin under the brim of his rain-soaked hat. "Y'all need some help?" he asked, his voice a raspy drawl that felt out of place in the cold night air. Ben forced a smile. Yeah, actually, we're out of gas." The man nodded, his smile growing wider. "Happens to a lot of folks out here. Not much of anything around, you know?" His eyes lingered on Chloe a moment too long, and she felt a chill run through her. "I got a gas can in the back," he said, jerking a thumb toward his van. "Lucky for you, huh?" Ben glanced at Chloe, then nodded cautiously. "Thanks. That'd be great." The man walked back to his van, but as he opened the rear doors, something fell out, a bundle wrapped in a tarp, dark and wet. It hit the ground with a dull thud. "Duh," and the man glanced at them, freezing for a moment before laughing, brushing it off as he kicked it back into the van. "Oops," he said, chuckling. That's just some old junk I'm hauling." Chloe's heart was hammering in her chest. She'd seen something dark, smeared on the tarp, something that looked like blood. The man grabbed the gas can and sauntered back to their car. As he poured the gas, he kept his eyes on them, that same unnerving grin never leaving his face. Chloe could feel herself shrinking into the seat, desperately wanting him to leave. "There you go," he said when he finished, tapping the hood. "Good to go." "Thanks," Ben said, trying to sound casual as he put the car into gear. "Appreciate it." But as he pressed the gas, the car wouldn't move. Ben's heart sank, and he realized why. The man had pulled some kind of lever that locked the front tires in place. They were stuck. He hadn't meant to help them. He'd meant to trap them. Chloe saw the man's grin turn menacing. He was staring at her through the window, his fingers tapping against the glass. "Why don't you two come on out?" he said, his voice almost playful. Ben hit the gas pedal, trying to force the car forward, but the wheels only spun helplessly. The man's face twisted into a grin as he watched their futile attempts to escape. In a panic, Ben reached for the door locks, but before he could engage them, the man yanked open Chloe's door, his hand darting out like a snake, grabbing her wrist with an iron grip. Chloe screamed, trying to pull free, but his grip was unbreakable. "Come on now," he hissed. "I don't bite. Not too hard, anyway." Without thinking, Ben lunged across the seat, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. He swung it at the man's hand, connecting with a sickening crack. The man let out a howl, releasing Chloe just long enough for Ben to slam the door shut and lock it. "Drive, Ben!" Chloe screamed, but Ben was already trying, his hands shaking as he struggled with the controls. The man pounded on the window, his face contorted in rage. "You think you can get away?" he snarled, his voice muffled but terrifying. But then the roar of an engine echoed down the road, and headlights flooded over them. Another car was approaching, a large pickup, its headlights shining bright. The man froze, his grin vanishing as he looked back at the approaching truck. He muttered something under his breath and retreated, disappearing into the darkness as the truck slowed down. The driver of the truck, a middle-aged man with a stern face, rolled down his window as he pulled up beside them. "Y'all all right?" he asked, his gaze darting between their terrified faces and the direction the man had vanished. Ben's voice shook as he tried to explain. This guy, we're stuck. He wouldn't let us leave." The truck driver's face hardened. "Get in. I'll drive you into town." Without hesitation, Ben and Chloe climbed into the truck, glancing over their shoulders to make sure the man wasn't following. As the truck pulled away, they saw the van still sitting on the side of the road, dark and silent, as if it were waiting for them to come back. They rode in silence, clutching each other's hands, not daring to look back. But as they entered the lights of the nearest town, Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't really escaped, that somewhere in the darkness of the back roads, that man was still out there, watching, waiting for his next chance. The night air was cold as Laura drove down the winding country road, the only sound the hum of her engine and the occasional scrape of tree branches against her car. She hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. Her gas gauge was getting dangerously low, but the directions had assured her there was a gas station up ahead. A quick fill-up, and she'd be back on track. Just as she was thinking she might make it without any trouble, the car started to sputter. She glanced down and cursed softly. The gas light was on, blinking red. She coasted to a stop, pulling over to the side of the road, surrounded by thick woods on either side. She tried her phone, but it was dead. All she had was a flashlight and her thin jacket. Laura looked around, trying to suppress a rising sense of dread. Her headlights stretched out, illuminating the empty road ahead, when, suddenly, she saw a flicker of movement. She squinted, trying to make it out. Someone was walking toward her, their shape just barely visible in the beam of her headlights. As they got closer, she saw it was an older woman, maybe in her 60s, dressed in an old, faded coat and carrying a rusty gas can. Laura rolled down her window a crack, her nerves prickling. Who would be walking down this road so late? The woman reached the window, her face half hidden in shadows. She had a strange, unsettling look, her eyes hollow and dark, almost lifeless. "Looks like you need some gas," the woman said, her voice low and almost hollow. Laura forced a smile, her hand hovering over the door lock. Yeah, I ran out. I was just about to walk to the station." The woman chuckled softly, but it sounded more like a hiss. "No need. I have some gas right here." She lifted the can, shaking it slightly, and Laura heard the slosh of liquid inside. The woman leaned closer, and Laura caught a faint, sickly sweet smell coming from her. It made her stomach turn. "Thanks," Laura said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can pay you for it." "Oh, that won't be necessary," the woman said, her voice strangely melodic, almost like she was reciting something she'd practiced. "Just sit tight. I'll take care of everything." Laura wanted to refuse, but something about the woman's gaze made her feel trapped, like she couldn't look away. The woman walked around to the side of the car, out of sight, and Laura's anxiety spiked. Her instincts told her to drive, to leave, but her car wasn't going anywhere. After a few seconds, the woman appeared at the passenger window, staring in at Laura, her face expressionless. "Why don't you step outside, dear? The night is so beautiful." Laura's skin crawled. She glanced at the dark forest and shook her head. "No, I'll just stay in here." The woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. An anger, sharp and immediate. "It's not polite to refuse someone's hospitality," she murmured, her tone dark. "Especially out here." Laura's heart was pounding now, and her hands shook as she locked the doors. The woman didn't move, just kept staring at her with that eerie, frozen smile. After a tense silence, Laura saw headlights appear in the distance. Relief washed over her as a truck approached, slowing down as it came up beside them. A man, maybe in his 40s, rolled down the truck window, his brow furrowed with concern as he looked between Laura and the strange woman standing outside her car. "You all right, miss?" he called out. Laura nodded, her voice breaking. I ran out of gas." The woman shot the man a dark glare, but her voice stayed smooth. "I was just helping her." The man didn't seem convinced. He looked at Laura, his gaze steady. "Why don't you come sit in my truck while I take a look?" Laura didn't hesitate. She grabbed her bag, unlocked her door, and quickly climbed out, her heart racing as she moved away from the woman. She could feel the woman's eyes on her, burning holes into her back. Once she was in the truck, the man handed her a phone. "You call someone to come get you," he said quietly, his gaze locked on the woman. "I'll handle this." Laura tried to call a friend, but the signal was weak. She kept glancing back at the road as she saw the man talking to the woman, who was growing visibly agitated, her body language tense and unnatural, like her limbs weren't moving quite right. As she watched, the woman seemed to grow angrier, her face twisting in an expression that was almost inhuman. She hissed something, then backed away into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as she'd appeared. The man got back into the truck, locking the doors and glancing into the rearview mirror. "She won't bother you now," he said, his voice a low murmur. Who was she?" Laura asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared out at the dark road ahead, his face tight with something that looked like fear. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I've seen her out here before. She shows up every now and then, always with that gas can, always looking for people stuck on the road." Laura shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Why? What does she want?" The man's expression darkened. "People say she's a ghost, died out here a long time ago, some kind of accident. Others say she's something worse, that she waits for people who don't leave." Laura felt a cold sweat break over her. "What happens if they don't leave?" The man shook his head slowly, his eyes distant. "No one knows. The people who go with her, they don't come back." They drove in silence for a while, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. After a few minutes, the man looked over at her. "Next time, don't stop, no matter what." Laura nodded, too shaken to respond. She glanced in the side mirror, her stomach twisting as she saw a shape far down the road, a figure standing alone, watching them leave. It was the woman, her silhouette unmistakable even in the darkness. She held the gas can, motionless, just waiting. As they turned a corner and she lost sight of the road, Laura felt a chill settle over her, an unsettling certainty that, no matter where she went, that woman would be waiting. David hated night shifts. The quiet hours felt like a trap, a slow crawl through the dark where every shadow felt alive. He was the only attendant at a small gas station on the outskirts of town, surrounded by miles of desolate fields and thick woods. Customers rarely showed up past midnight, but he had to keep the place open until dawn. The dim neon lights cast an eerie glow over the empty pumps, and he tried to ignore the feeling that he was being watched. It was around 2 a.m. when he saw headlights in the distance. A car was slowly rolling up the road toward the station, headlights flickering in a strange, uneven rhythm. As it got closer, David noticed it was an old, beat-up sedan, rusted around the edges with a long crack running down the windshield. The car coasted to a stop by the pump, and David peered through the glass, squinting to see if anyone was getting out. But no one did. The car just sat there, engine idling with its headlights pointed directly into the store. David waited a minute, then another, expecting the driver to step out, but no one appeared. Feeling a bit uneasy, he tapped on the glass with his knuckles and gave a little wave. The windows of the car were darkly tinted, so he couldn't see inside. Another minute passed, and David began to feel a creeping unease slithering up his spine. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cool night air prickling his skin. He approached the car slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called out, keeping his distance. "Need any help?" The car's engine suddenly cut off, and the silence was suffocating. David waited, his heart pounding, as he stared at the driver's side window. He could have sworn he saw something move inside, a faint outline of someone in the driver's seat, but it was hard to tell. Swallowing hard, David reached for the window, tapping it gently with his flashlight. "Sir? Ma'am? Do you need assistance?" In the silence, he heard a faint scratching sound, like nails scraping against metal. He took a step back, his pulse quickening. The sound grew louder, and he realized it was coming from inside the car, from the trunk. David's instincts screamed at him to back away, to return to the safety of the store, but something compelled him forward. He took another step, his hand reaching out toward the trunk's handle almost on its own. Just as his fingers brushed the handle, the trunk popped open, revealing a gaping, dark void. His flashlight beam flickered, and he caught a glimpse of something inside. A pale hand, motionless, stretched out as if it had been reaching toward freedom. The fingers were long and thin, disturbingly skeletal, and the skin was a sickly gray. He stumbled back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. But before he could react, the hand twitched, the fingers curling and uncurling as if waking up. A soft, chilling whisper floated out from the trunk. "Help me." David's blood ran cold. He backed away, nearly tripping over his own feet as he scrambled toward the store. The whisper grew louder, pleading and desperate, echoing through the silent night. "Please, help me." David turned and ran, his heart pounding as he burst back into the store. He locked the door behind him, breathing heavily, and backed up to the counter, his eyes fixed on the car outside. The trunk was still open, but he could no longer see the hand. The pleading voice had stopped. Moments later, the car door creaked open. David's eyes widened as a figure stepped out. A man, tall and impossibly thin, his face obscured by a dark hood. The figure moved slowly, unnaturally, his body contorting as he stepped around the car. David watched, frozen with fear, as the man approached the store, his head tilting at an odd angle, as if studying him through the glass. The man's hands pressed against the window, and David could finally see his face, or what was left of it. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets, staring blankly into the store. His mouth twisted into an unnatural smile, revealing teeth too sharp, too long. David's breath caught in his throat as the figure lifted one skeletal finger and tapped it against the glass. 3 slow, deliberate knocks that echoed in the silence. "Let me in," the man whispered, his voice a raspy hiss. "I need help. Can you help me?" David shook his head, inching back. I can't. Please, just go." The figure's smile faded, replaced by an expression of dark disappointment. "You don't want to help me?" he asked, tilting his head further, his eyes narrowing. David didn't answer, his whole body trembling. He reached under the counter, fumbling for the panic button. His fingers found it, and he pressed it, hoping it would summon someone, anyone, to help him. But the figure outside didn't move. He simply watched, his hollow eyes following David's every move. After a few moments, the figure backed away, his gaze never leaving David. He walked back to the car, his steps slow and deliberate, and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, headlights flickering again as the car rolled forward. But just as David thought the nightmare was over, the car came to an abrupt stop. The trunk slammed shut, and the passenger door opened. Another figure stepped out, this one shorter, with long, tangled hair and pale, bruised skin. Her face was even more horrifying than the man's, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. She, too, began walking toward the store, her steps slow and jerky as if she were being controlled by invisible strings. David's hand hovered over the phone, desperate to call for help, but he knew it was too late. The figures were both at the window now, their faces pressed against the glass, eyes locked onto him with a burning intensity. They raised their hands in unison, tapping on the window in a slow, rhythmic pattern that filled him with a cold, paralyzing fear. "Let us in! Let us in! Let us in!" they chanted, their voices blending into a haunting harmony. David backed up against the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could feel their eyes piercing through him, their voices echoing in his mind. Finally, with a shudder, he closed his eyes, praying they would leave. When he opened them again, the figures were gone. The car was gone. The parking lot was empty, as if they'd never been there. The night dragged on, silent and still, but David never shook the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting for him to unlock the door, to let them in. And as dawn finally broke, he knew he'd never work another night shift again. But deep down, he also knew that it wouldn't matter, because one day he would hear that familiar knock at his door, that same whispered plea, and he feared that this time he wouldn't be able to say no. Tom's car coasted to a halt on a desolate stretch of highway just past midnight. He was miles away from civilization, his gas tank empty, and the silence around him felt suffocating. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by dense, dark woods. He cursed himself for not stopping at the last gas station, but he'd thought he could make it a little farther. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. He sighed, contemplating the long walk ahead of him, when suddenly he saw a flickering light down the road, a faint glow moving slowly toward him. Relief flooded through him. Maybe it was another driver, maybe even someone with spare gas. He stepped out of the car, squinting to see the light more clearly. As it approached, he could make out a figure, a person holding a lantern. They walked in an odd, stiff manner, their silhouette faintly visible in the dim light. "Hey!" Tom called out, waving his hand. "Could you help me? I'm out of gas." The figure didn't respond, but kept moving forward. As they got closer, Tom could see it was an older man wearing an old-fashioned coat and hat, his face obscured by shadows. The lantern cast strange, distorted shapes across his face, making it hard to make out his features. The man stopped a few feet away, his expression blank, eyes fixed on Tom with an unsettling intensity. His skin looked ashen, and he didn't seem to blink. "Good evening," the man said, his voice hollow and flat, as if he were forcing the words out. "Stranded, are you?" Tom nodded, unnerved by the man's stiff demeanor. "Yeah, I ran out of gas a few miles back. Do you know if there's a station nearby?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, there's no gas station around here, but I can give you a lift. My house isn't far." Tom hesitated. Something about the man felt off. But what choice did he have? There was no cell service, and he hadn't seen another car in hours. "Thanks," Tom said, forcing a smile. "I'd appreciate that." The man turned and started walking back the way he'd come, moving with that same eerie stiffness. Tom followed, shoving his hands in his pockets, feeling a growing sense of unease with every step. After a few minutes, they reached an old, rusted truck parked on the side of the road. It looked ancient, the paint faded and flaking, and Tom could swear he saw streaks of something dark smeared along the side of it. "Hop in," the man said, gesturing to the passenger door. Tom climbed in, the seat creaking under him. The air inside the truck was thick, smelling of damp earth and something else he couldn't identify. The man climbed in beside him, setting the lantern on the dashboard, its flickering light casting strange shadows across the cracked windshield. As they started down the road, Tom noticed that the headlights weren't on, yet the man drove with perfect confidence, steering through the darkness as if he knew every twist and turn. "You live around here?" Tom asked, trying to break the silence. The man nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the road. "Been here all my life. Folks call me Eddie. It's rare to see anyone out here so late." "Yeah, just bad timing, I guess," Tom replied, laughing nervously. He glanced at the man, noticing for the first time that his clothes seemed wrong. The fabric was threadbare, the style old-fashioned, like something from decades ago. "Do you get many travelers around here?" Tom asked, feeling a strange urge to fill the silence. Eddie's mouth twisted into that strange, empty smile again. "Not many. Most folks don't last long out here. They get lost, or something finds them." Tom swallowed, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. "Something?" Eddie didn't respond. They drove in silence, the darkness pressing in around them, until finally a small house came into view, barely visible through the overgrown trees. It looked ancient, its roof sagging, the wood warped and rotting. There were no lights on, and the windows were dark and empty. "This is your place?" Tom asked, unable to hide his unease. Eddie nodded, his face expressionless. "You're welcome to come in, get warm, maybe make a call." Tom's instincts screamed at him to refuse, but he was exhausted, and he still had no other options. He climbed out of the truck, following Eddie up the creaking porch steps. As he approached the door, he noticed something strange. There were dark, hand-shaped smears on the walls, as if someone had clawed at the wood. Inside, the house was cold and silent. There was barely any furniture, just an old table and a few dusty chairs. Faded photographs lined the walls, all of them depicting the same woman, her face pale and eyes hollow. Eddie gestured to one of the chairs. "Sit down. I'll make some tea." Tom sat, feeling more and more uneasy as he glanced around the room. Everything felt frozen, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The photographs on the walls seemed to watch him, their eyes following his every move. A few minutes later, Eddie returned with 2 cups of tea, setting one in front of Tom. "Drink," he said, his voice oddly insistent. Tom hesitated, lifting the cup to his lips. The tea smelled strange, metallic, but he took a small sip out of politeness. Immediately, his mouth filled with an acrid taste that made him gag. Eddie watched him intently, his eyes cold and calculating. "Good, isn't it?" Tom forced a smile, setting the cup down. Yeah, thanks." Eddie's gaze lingered on him, unblinking. "You remind me of someone I knew," he said softly, his voice carrying a strange, wistful tone. "A young man who passed through here a long time ago." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Really?" Eddie's face twisted into a smile, his teeth unnaturally sharp. "Yes, I offered him my help too. But he didn't make it far." A chill ran down Tom's spine. He stood up, edging toward the door. "You know what? I think I'll just walk back to my car. I don't want to trouble you anymore." Eddie stood, blocking his path. His face seemed different now, paler, his skin almost translucent. "Oh, you're no trouble," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not yet." Tom backed away, his heart pounding. "Thanks for the tea, but I really need to get going." Eddie stepped closer, his eyes dark and empty. "You can't leave, Tom," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Not after coming all this way." Tom turned and bolted, racing for the door. He threw it open and sprinted outside, not daring to look back. He heard footsteps behind him, heavy and relentless, bah, as he stumbled through the dark yard, branches clawing at his skin. Finally, he reached the road, gasping for breath. He glanced back, expecting to see Eddie following him, but the house was gone. There was nothing but darkness and trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. Panicked, he stumbled forward, his heart racing as he tried to find his way back to his car. But no matter how far he walked, the road seemed to twist and turn, leading him in circles. The darkness pressed in around him, thicker and more oppressive, and he felt as if he were being watched, hunted. Just when he thought he couldn't go any further, he heard a familiar sound, the creak of a truck rolling up behind him. He turned, his heart sinking as he saw the old truck again, its headlights flickering. The passenger door opened, and Eddie's voice drifted through the darkness, cold and mocking. "Get in, Tom," he said, his smile stretched wide in the dim light. "You'll never make it out on your own." Tom took a step back, then another, but he knew he was trapped. The darkness stretched endlessly around him, and Eddie's eyes gleamed, empty and hollow, as he waited. And as Tom's last shred of hope faded, he understood that he would never leave these woods. Eddie had been waiting for him all along. Molly's car slowed to a stop on the narrow, winding mountain road, her headlights dimming as the engine sputtered. She'd left the city hours ago and hadn't seen another car since. When she glanced at the gas gauge, she cursed. It was on empty. She hadn't seen a gas station for miles, and now her phone showed no service. The silence around her was profound, broken only by the soft rustling of wind through the dense, towering trees. She tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't turn over. After a few tries, she gave up, resting her head on the steering wheel. "Just great," she muttered. She thought about staying in the car until morning, but the isolation felt oppressive. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped out, shivering in the cool night air. There was a faint glimmer of light up ahead on the road, maybe a house or a cabin. She'd take her chances. As she walked, the light grew closer, brighter, and she realized it wasn't a house or a cabin. It was an old gas station, almost hidden by the thick trees. Relief washed over her as she approached the small, weathered building. There was a single pump out front and a neon open sign that flickered on and off in erratic intervals. She peered through the window, but the inside looked dark. She pushed the door open and a little bell rang. The smell inside was old and musty, like rotting wood and dust. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing in the emptiness. After a moment, a man shuffled out from a back room. He was older, with deep-set eyes and clothes that looked as if they hadn't been washed in ages. His gaze was unsettling, his eyes studying her as if he hadn't seen another person in years. "Out of gas?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah," she replied, trying to sound friendly. "My car broke down a little ways back. Do you have any gas?" The man smiled, a thin, unnerving smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I think we can work something out. You alone?" Molly hesitated, feeling a sudden chill. "Yeah, but I don't plan on staying long. Just need enough gas to get back on the main road." He nodded slowly, still watching her. "Not many people pass through here. Bad luck, that." He walked behind the counter and rummaged around, eventually pulling out an old, rusty gas can. "I'll fill it up for you. Costs extra out here, though." "Fine," Molly said, her voice shaky as she fumbled with her wallet. She watched him disappear out the door to the pump, and something about his walk, slow and methodical, unnerved her. She glanced around the room, noticing old photos on the walls. The images were of people standing by cars, all looking eerily similar, unsmiling, vacant expressions staring straight into the camera. One photo caught her eye. It was a picture of a young woman standing by a car that looked just like hers, and the date scrawled on the bottom was from nearly 20 years ago. She shivered, stepping back. There was a whole row of these photos, all with different people, but the same eerie look in their eyes, the same faint fog surrounding them. "Ma'am?" The man's voice made her jump. He was back, holding the filled gas can, his gaze lingering on her reaction. "Got your gas here." Molly forced a smile, taking the can from him. "Thanks. How much do I owe you?" He smiled that thin, unsettling smile again. "Just leave a picture for the wall." She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Picture?" "Yes, for the memories." His eyes didn't waver from her. "Go ahead, stand by the counter there, and I'll take it." The air felt suddenly cold, pressing in on her. Every instinct told her to run, but her body was frozen, rooted in place. He raised an old, worn Polaroid camera, pointing it at her, waiting for her to move in front of the counter. In a flash of desperate courage, she turned and bolted out the door, the gas can banging against her leg as she ran. She heard the man's footsteps behind her, faster now, his breath ragged. She didn't look back, racing down the dark road, her flashlight shaking in her hand. When she finally reached her car, she fumbled with the gas cap, her hands trembling as she poured the fuel in. She didn't care how much spilled, she just needed enough to start the engine and get away. As she climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was standing in the road, his silhouette barely visible in the faint light, watching her, that eerie smile still plastered on his face. The engine roared to life, and she peeled out, speeding down the road as fast as she could. For the first few miles, she kept glancing in her mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following her. But the road remained empty, and after a while she began to relax, her heartbeat gradually slowing. Then her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, lighting up with a notification. She picked it up, frowning, and opened her camera app. Her stomach dropped. There in her photo roll was a new picture. A Polaroid-style image of her standing in the gas station, looking pale and terrified. It was identical to the photos on the wall she'd seen, down to the faint fog and her vacant expression. A cold dread settled over her, and she quickly deleted the photo, hoping it was some kind of glitch. She kept driving, desperate to put as much distance as possible between her and that place. But as dawn broke, her phone buzzed again. Another photo had appeared, this time of her in her car, looking into the rearview mirror, eyes wide with fear. She deleted it, her hands shaking, but moments later, another picture appeared, showing her from a different angle, even closer. Panicked, she threw her phone onto the seat, her mind racing. She didn't understand how it was happening, but every time she deleted a photo, a new one took its place. Each picture captured her in real time, as if someone or something was watching her. She drove faster, the road stretching on endlessly. She glanced in the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see him there. But there was no one. Just as she thought she might lose her mind, she saw a gas station up ahead, one she hadn't passed before, even though she'd been driving in a straight line. She slowed down, her stomach churning as she recognized the peeling paint, the flickering neon sign. It was the same gas station. Somehow she'd driven in a perfect circle. The realization hit her like a punch. She was trapped. As she sat there, staring at the gas station, her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. Her hands shook as she picked it up, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the latest photo. It was of her sitting in the car, staring at the gas station. And this time, she wasn't alone. The man was standing next to her window, his face twisted into that thin, unsettling smile, staring straight at the camera. Jared was just a few miles away from the remote cabin he'd rented when his gaslight flicked on. The nearest town was at least 40 miles back, and the road ahead was nothing but dense woods and fog. He glanced at his phone, no signal. He cursed under his breath, regretting his decision to take the scenic route. A little farther down the road, the car sputtered, then died completely. He coasted to the shoulder and for takes, mentally kicking himself for not stopping to fill up earlier. The silence was oppressive. The kind that only existed in deep woods, where the trees loomed close to the road, branches reaching out like fingers. Jared stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, and tried to figure out his options. A faint light flickered through the trees down the road. It looked like a cabin. Maybe someone could give him a lift, or at least let him use a phone. The light seemed to be coming from a kerosene lantern in the window of an old, run-down cabin just off the road. The building looked as if it had been abandoned for years. The wood was dark, warped with age, and the porch sagged as if it might collapse, but the light was unmistakably on, casting an eerie glow through the fog. He walked up to the cabin and knocked, hearing the hollow echo inside. After a long pause, the door creaked open on its own, swinging inward slowly, revealing a dark, empty room. "Hello?" he called out, stepping inside hesitantly. The air was stale and cold, thick with a scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. He stepped further in, looking around. The lantern on the table flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls. The entire place felt frozen in time, as if someone had just stepped out and would be back any minute. He took a few more steps, and then he noticed them. Pictures on the walls, each in a dark, weathered frame. He squinted at them, feeling a chill as he realized they were all photos of people. People standing by cars, mostly, each with an expression of frozen fear. And in the background of each photo was this very cabin. One picture in particular caught his eye, a young man with dark hair staring wide-eyed into the camera. His clothes looked modern, almost identical to what Jared was wearing. A shiver crawled up his spine as he realized the man looked eerily familiar. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked behind him. Jared spun around, but no one was there, just the dark, empty room, the lantern's light casting twisted shadows. He took a step back, bumping into something solid. His breath hitched as he turned slowly, looking up into the eyes of a tall, gaunt figure standing in the doorway. The man was wearing an old-fashioned coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over most of his face. What little Jared could see looked pale, almost waxy. "You lost?" the man asked in a low, gravelly voice. Jared's throat felt dry, but he managed to stammer, "Yeah, I ran out of gas. I was hoping someone here could help." The man's lips twisted into a smile, though his eyes remained flat and empty. "You're a bit far out for help, don't you think?" Jared took a shaky breath, forcing himself to sound calmer than he felt. "Yeah, I know, but do you have a phone I could use? Or maybe some gas?" The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, almost animalistic. "I might be able to help you," he said, stepping closer, "but everything has a price." The man's eyes flicked to the pictures on the wall, and Jared's gaze followed, settling once again on the photograph of the young man who looked just like him. He turned back to the man, his pulse pounding in his ears. I'll pay whatever you want," Jared said, though he wasn't sure why he was suddenly so desperate to make a deal. His gut told him to run, but something about the man's stare felt paralyzing. The man nodded slowly. "Then come outside. I'll show you where the gas is." Jared hesitated but forced himself to follow the man out the door, his flashlight barely cutting through the fog as they walked around to the back of the cabin. In the dim light, he saw a row of rusted gas cans lined up along the wall. "Take whichever one you like," the man said, standing just behind him. Jared leaned down, grabbing one of the cans. As he lifted it, he realized it felt heavier than it should have, more solid, almost like it was filled with something thick, too dense to be just gas. A strong metallic smell hit his nose. He unscrewed the cap and recoiled as a thick, dark liquid sloshed out. It wasn't gas, it was something darker, something that looked disturbingly like blood. He dropped the can, stumbling backward. What the hell is this?" The man's face twisted into a grim, almost amused expression. "I told you, everything has a price." Jared backed away, his mind racing with panic. He glanced back toward his car, wondering if he could make a run for it, but the man was blocking his path, his expression darkening. "You can't leave, Jared. Not until you've paid your debt." Jared's breath came in ragged gasps. What are you talking about?" The man reached into his coat, pulling out an old, cracked Polaroid camera. Before Jared could react, he raised it, pointing it directly at him. The flash went off, blinding Jared for a moment. When he blinked the spots from his vision, he found himself standing alone in the clearing. The man was gone, the gas cans vanished, and the cabin itself looked darker, more decayed, as if it had been abandoned for decades. Shaking, he turned to leave, but as he walked back toward his car, he felt an unnatural chill settle over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. When he finally reached his car, he climbed inside and slammed the door, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. It sputtered to life on the first try, despite having been empty minutes before. Relieved but thoroughly shaken, he sped down the road, refusing to look back. The next day, as he was unpacking his bags at home, he noticed something strange in his glove compartment. Curiously, he reached in and pulled out an old Polaroid photograph, his hands trembling as he realized what he was looking at. It was a picture of him standing in front of the gas cans behind the cabin, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. And in the background, he could just make out the figure of the man, watching him with that unnervingly blank smile. Jared felt a wave of dread as he dropped the photo, knowing that somehow, no matter where he went, he'd always be haunted by that night and by whatever dark debt he'd unknowingly paid. Liz was driving home after a late shift, her eyelids heavy as her car sliced through the thick darkness of the rural back roads. She'd taken this shortcut dozens of times before, even though it always felt a bit eerie at night, but tonight felt especially isolated. Her fuel gauge was low, something she'd noticed back at the hospital, but she hadn't had time to stop. She figured she could make it. Half an hour from town, her car sputtered and came to a slow, painful stop. Liz groaned, her stomach knotting with frustration. She checked her phone, but of course, there was no service. She leaned back in her seat, weighing her options. Walking seemed like the only choice. Gathering her nerves, she grabbed her flashlight and started down the road, her shoes crunching against the gravel as she walked, the beam cutting a narrow path in the darkness. The trees on either side of the road were dense, and each sound of the woods, leaves rustling, branches snapping, echoed in the silence. After what felt like an eternity, she saw a faint light up ahead. She quickened her pace, eventually making out an old farmhouse with a dim yellow glow coming from a single window. Relieved, she approached and knocked on the door. The door opened a crack, and an old woman's face appeared, lit only by the faint glow of an oil lamp. She looked at Liz with sharp, intense eyes. "Out of gas?" she asked, as if she already knew the answer. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Yeah," Liz replied, her voice sounding small in the stillness. "I was hoping to borrow a phone, or maybe get some gas if you have any." The woman's lips stretched into a thin smile. Come in. I don't have a phone, but I might be able to help you with some gas." She opened the door wider, motioning Liz inside. The house was dim and smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic and unsettling. The old woman led her into a small living room, where Liz noticed strange objects decorating the shelves. Old clocks, antique dolls, and jars filled with dark, unidentifiable objects lined the walls. Liz's skin prickled as she scanned the room. "I'll get that gas," the woman said, her eyes lingering on Liz a moment too long before she disappeared into the kitchen. As Liz waited, she felt an uncomfortable pressure building in the room, like she was being watched. Her gaze shifted to a photo on the mantel, depicting a family in front of the house, a man, a woman, and a young girl. But it was the woman who caught her eye. The resemblance to the woman she'd just met was uncanny, though she looked decades younger. Her eyes drifted to the girl in the photo, and Liz's heart skipped a beat. The girl was wearing a necklace with a tiny, intricate charm, a charm she recognized. It was hanging on the wall across from her, old and tarnished. She moved closer, squinting at it. Beneath it, a small brass plate read, "Missing, 1963. A chill ran down her spine, and she quickly stepped back, nearly bumping into the old woman, who'd returned silently, holding a rusty can of gas. "Here you are, dear," the woman said, her voice gentle, but her eyes seemed to glint with something dark. "It's not much, but it should get you back to town." "Thank you," Liz said, forcing a smile as she took the can. As she turned to leave, the woman's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. Liz's heart raced as the woman leaned in, her voice a low hiss. "Be careful on your way back. This road can take people, especially at night." Liz pulled her wrist free, mumbling a hurried thank you before rushing outside, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel the woman's eyes on her as she hurried back down the driveway. She was halfway back to her car when a soft sound stopped her in her tracks. It was a child's voice whispering her name from somewhere in the trees. "Liz." Her blood turned to ice. She flashed her light toward the sound but saw nothing, just the endless shadows between the trees. She took a step back, her heart racing as the voice called her name again, this time closer. Against her better judgment, she called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. She turned and started walking faster, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. The trees seemed closer than they had before, looming over the road like silent sentinels. Her light started to flicker, casting wild shadows around her. Just as she reached her car, her flashlight died completely, plunging her into darkness. She felt her way to the gas cap, her hands shaking as she poured the gas into the tank. As she fumbled with the nozzle, she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. She turned, her eyes straining in the darkness, but saw no one. She forced herself to breathe, to calm down, telling herself it was just the wind or her imagination. She climbed into her car, locking the doors and praying it would start. The engine roared to life, and she let out a sigh of relief. She was about to drive away when she glanced in her rearview mirror. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by her taillights. A young girl, staring at her with wide, empty eyes. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and around her neck was the same charm Liz had seen in the farmhouse. Liz froze, her hand clenching the steering wheel. She blinked, and the girl was gone. Heart pounding, she threw the car into drive and sped down the road, desperate to put as much distance between herself and that farmhouse as possible. She didn't look back, not until she was back in the safety of her own driveway. As she stumbled into her house, she tried to shake off the fear, like convincing herself it was all just a nightmare, a trick of the dark and her exhausted mind. But when she tossed her purse onto the kitchen counter, something shiny tumbled out. She froze, staring at it. It was the charm, the one from the farmhouse, from the photograph. Somehow it was here, in her house. She stared at it, her mind racing, trying to make sense of how it had ended up with her. But there was no answer. Just the chilling realization that no matter how far she ran, something from that dark, forgotten road had followed her home. Emily was driving through the endless stretches of cornfields, her headlights piercing the foggy night. She'd been on the road for hours, heading to her sister's house to surprise her, when her gas light blinked on. She'd passed a gas station a ways back, but had convinced herself she could make it. Now, the car sputtered as it ran out of fuel, coasting to a stop in the middle of nowhere. The silence around her was almost suffocating, the thick mist settling heavily over the road. Her phone was dead. She hadn't been able to find her charger when she packed. The fields on either side of the road swayed gently in the night breeze, creating a soft rustling that set her nerves on edge. She didn't want to stay in the car, so she grabbed her flashlight and started walking down the road. After what felt like forever, she saw a faint light up ahead. Her heart leaped at the thought of finding help. She walked faster until she reached a small, run-down gas station she hadn't noticed before. The building was old, with a single flickering light above the door and a single pump standing out front. The sign in the window said, "Open," but the whole place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. She hesitated, but she didn't have many options. She pushed open the door, a small bell tinkling overhead. Inside, the gas station was dim and smelled of dust and old oil. She approached the counter, glancing around. "Hello? Anyone here?" she called, her voice echoing in the empty room. After a long silence, a man appeared from the shadows at the back of the store. He was tall and gaunt, with skin that looked almost gray in the dim light. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something from the 1940s, and he wore a strange, wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his eyes. "Out of gas, I presume?" he said, his voice deep and hollow. "Yes," she stammered, feeling uneasy under his gaze. "Do you have any?" "We have gas," he interrupted, a thin smile stretching across his face. "But out here, things aren't always so simple. There's a price." Emily shifted uncomfortably. "I can pay, that's no problem." His smile grew wider. "It's not about money. Around here, the price is something a bit different." Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out an old, rusty key. "There's a cabin down the road, just off the main path through the cornfield. The gas is stored there. If you want it, you'll have to go and retrieve it." Her stomach twisted at the thought of wandering through a stranger's property at night, but she was stranded, and there wasn't much else she could do. "Okay," she agreed, reluctantly, taking the key from him. His fingers were cold as they brushed against hers. "Be careful out there," he murmured, his voice soft. "And whatever you do, don't stray from the path. You don't want to get lost in those fields. They have a way of keeping people." She left the station, feeling the man's eyes on her as she walked down the narrow dirt path that cut through the cornfield. The tall stalks rose up around her, casting shadows that twisted in the moonlight. She could barely see the faint outline of the cabin in the distance. The quiet was suffocating. All she could hear was the soft rustling of the corn, the occasional snap of a stalk breaking, and her own breath. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her from within the rows. After a few minutes, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. She stopped, shining her flashlight into the field, but there was nothing there. She continued, her heart pounding, until she finally reached the cabin. The cabin was as rundown as the gas station, with paint peeling off the walls and broken windows. She unlocked the door with the rusty key, her hands shaking. Inside, it was dark and musty, with the faint smell of mold and something else, something sour and metallic. She found the gas can sitting on a dusty shelf near the back. Relieved, she grabbed it and started to turn back toward the door, when she noticed something strange in the corner of the room. It was a pile of objects, old, tattered clothing, shoes, a few torn-up bags. Curiosity got the better of her, and she knelt down, examining the pile more closely. Among the clothes, she saw a worn leather jacket that looked familiar. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized it was identical to the one her sister's ex-boyfriend, Eric, used to wear. He'd gone missing a few years ago, right after their breakup, and no one had ever found him. Her hand trembled as she pulled back, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. But before she could think, she heard a soft rustling outside, like footsteps slowly shuffling through the corn. The sound grew closer, steady and deliberate, until it was right outside the door. Emily froze, holding her breath, as a dark silhouette appeared in the doorway. It was a man, but his face was obscured in shadow. He took a slow step forward, and Emily could see that his clothes were caked with dirt and mud. His skin looked gray and brittle, and his eyes were wide, unseeing, as though he were staring right through her. Without thinking, she clutched the gas can and bolted past him, pushing him out of the way. He stumbled, his body moving stiffly, as though his joints had forgotten how to work. She ran back through the cornfield, ignoring the sensation of eyes watching her from between the stalks. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as she sprinted, her pulse hammering in her ears. Finally, she reached the gas station and burst through the door, gasping for breath. The man behind the counter looked up, his expression unreadable. "Did you find what you needed?" he asked calmly. Emily shoved the gas can onto the counter, her voice shaking. What was that? Who was that in the field?" The man tilted his head slightly, his thin smile returning. "They're the ones who never made it out. They wander the fields at night looking for something they lost, or someone to take their place." She stared at him, horrified, as he took the gas can and slid it toward her. "Best be on your way," he said, his eyes glinting with a strange light. And remember, once you leave, don't look back. They don't take kindly to those who linger." Without another word, she took the gas can, ran out to her car, and poured the fuel as fast as she could. She started the engine and sped off down the road, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. In her rearview mirror, she could see the faint outline of the gas station, now completely dark. And for just a moment, she thought she saw shadowy figures moving through the corn, drifting toward the road. She forced herself to look away, her heart racing, and didn't stop driving until she reached the safety of the highway. But even then, as she finally felt the weight of fear start to lift, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her out of those fields. Something that would always be watching, waiting for her to lose her way again.